My name is Walter Seidl, and I'm a curator of the art collection of Erste Group and the Erste Foundation, which is actually a bank's art collection dealing mainly with art from Central and Eastern Europe. But I'm also working as a freelance writer, curator, artist, and have all kinds of different jobs. So I'm originally from Graz, Austria, but studied in the States, in France, and Austria, and have lived in Vienna for almost 17 years now. If you look at the younger art generation today, it's always hard to kind of make a living as an artist per se, or just as an artist, because there's so many different, artists out there, galleries, and it is not always a question of whether you do or you're able to do good art or produce good art, but it's always the connection part, that on the one hand who you know and how you get into galleries, and of course it's always a power game today to see who is represented in galleries, and also which gallerists or which dealers can really push you on an international market. So in this case, it's of course not so easy to live in a city like Vienna. Of course there are some galleries who are really important and good, but then it's mostly the same artists who are always pushed forward on an international scale, and that's why it's always a bit of a struggle for the younger generation to make it into a gallery, and also to stay there, and to also make sure that the works get sold, because it always depends also on the galleries, and see how they push your work, how they bring your work onto an international arena. Yeah, and for those who do not really adhere to a gallery or belong to a galleries program, there's all kinds of made spaces or off spaces in a way that artists work upon, and be that they are squatting somewhere in a house and then kind of use the space for temporary exhibitions. And a lot of these initiatives, for example the Weiße House or the White House in Vienna, started off like this kind of not squatting, but necessarily kind of like a temporary space where you are in one building and then move to the next a couple of months later, but kind of also after a while succeed in getting public money, which is money by the government, that you get some fees or some money for maintenance, and then still also kind of develop your own critical program in a space that is not necessarily commercial or meant to be a place for selling, but still a place for information, for showing the works, because that's, I think, the most important thing for every young artist at the beginning, that you kind of start showing the works, and mostly the sales or living from that comes at a later stage, but of course it's the most important thing to just be out there and have your work out there. If you look at the international art market, this is always a big deal. For example, let's say in the US, where you have the big galleries and the rich kids going to art school, where basically they bring their collectors already when they finish school, and then kind of make a deal with the gallery. So if you really look at the art market, it works differently in different cities, but most notably, of course, in New York or London or Paris, there it's a special deal, because there it's everything about money and about power, and not necessarily about finding or discovering the new talents, but also kind of in a way to see how money gets from A to B and kind of stays in a certain circle. If you look at the varieties of art production, then of course if you look at a lot of the, let's say, New York or Chelsea art galleries, that what you find there is a lot of decorative material, pieces that I would say are two-dimensional, that are meant to fit nicely to somebody's apartment or house. But then of course I think art has to be more than just a decoration tool, and in my opinion it's always interesting also to look at those artists who are really radical or activist in their work, and who do not really produce work that necessarily has to be an object or a piece of two-dimensional painting whatever, but kind of like where you kind of really try to trigger certain social developments, where you kind of like work actively and interfere into political agendas, into political, let's say, debates, and that I think is important to keep this balance. Also, not only look at prices for art and at let's say market value, but also at what art can do for social developments and also for social change. It's also like for, especially let's say in Austria, there's a lot of grants given by the ministry and by the government to make artists also live and produce their work outside the necessity to kind of like sell it to a gallery, but really to kind of do site-specific works, for example, or to go on residencies to different countries and produce work there, to kind of like get in touch with different artistic scenes and kind of also have the ability to travel to produce work and not having to produce work and then getting money for it when it's sold, but getting money right from the beginning, to be able at all to kind of work on new things and new ideas, and this I think is very helpful if you have this subsidies and also grants that are given, and not necessarily where you have to have work to be sold afterwards, but where you can start with some money to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in Europe there's still more room for more, I think, thinking processes and reflections on art, and also on the issues raised by art and how art influences society or can be part of society, and kind of like where you talk more about certain mechanisms and what art can do, what art can trigger. Whereas in the US it's more that art is more, or ever since Andy Warhol, has become more kind of like a commodity, where you just see an object, something tangible, or something that has this relation to museum, gallery, market, money. Whereas I think there is more ephemeral notions of producing art in Europe still, where people are actively engaged in certain processes within, let's say, the city, within certain structural changes, urban changes, etc. So where you can really interfere into current societal processes, and where it's not only necessary to just have an object we use that has to be sold later on. I think that's the difference, where in Europe you can still experiment more in a way. Not that you cannot do it in the US, but it's like in the US I think the sales and money comes first, and then, for example, if you have enough, that you kind of like can allow yourself to kind of play around a little bit and do more experimental stuff. But in Europe, I would say it's still that a lot of artists start from this kind of interference notion, like interference into social processes, into active involvement, and that is something that I would say is still more visible in European art production.